Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our reading of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, a thing that I wasn't planning for. I didn't prepare to do this kind of a series. I just sort of fell into it, and oh boy, what fun has it been. Oh my gosh. I'm reading this battered old trade paperback, and a number of you are doing me the incredible honor of reading this along with me, including a few people who are reading it for the first time, which feels like an extra honor to me, honestly. Because I'm not just reading the book. This is not an audiobook. I am interpolating commentary. And when it comes to interpolating commentary, well, we are up to chapter 58 today, and I feel like I should warn you ahead of time, especially those of you who are not all that familiar with the book, that in this chapter contains a crime. A crime against art. One of the greatest crimes against art that anyone has ever perpetrated. So you think 1911, when the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre, and in my opinion was never actually returned, not the original. You think 1990, the famous art heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum here in Boston, where priceless paintings were cut out of their gilt frames and will never be seen again. The crime against art in this chapter is equally as bad. I just want to prepare you. That's all. Make sure you're sitting down. Make sure you have your lorgnette in place. This is chapter 58. Instead of receiving any such letter of excuse from his friend, as Elizabeth half expected Mr. Bingley to do, he was able to bring Darcy with him to Longbourn before many days had passed after Lady Catherine's visit. Elizabeth is expecting the worst. Lady Catherine has stormed off from Longbourn, vowing to make trouble about this rumored offer of marriage from Darcy. But keep in mind, Elizabeth has not heard and has no idea he's ever going to make. So she's expecting the worst. The gentleman arrived early, and before Mrs. Bennet had time to tell him of their having seen his aunt, of which her daughter sat in momentary dread, Bingley, who wanted to be alone with Jane, proposed their all walking out. It was agreed to. Mrs. Bennet was not in the habit of walking. Mary could never spare the time, from her reading, no doubt, but the remaining five set off. What's that sound I hear? A fifth wheel? I hear a fifth wheel. Bingley and Jane, however, soon allowed the others to outstrip them. They lagged behind, while Elizabeth, Kitty, and Darcy were to entertain each other. Very little was said by either. Kitty was too much afraid of him to talk. Elizabeth was secretly forming a desperate resolution, and perhaps he might be doing the same thing. They walked towards the Lucases because Kitty wished to call on Maria, and as Elizabeth saw no occasion for making it a general concern, when Kitty left them, she went boldly on with him alone. Now was the moment for her resolution to be executed, and while her courage was high, she immediately said, "Mr. Darcy, I am a very selfish creature, and for the sake of giving relief to my own feelings, care not how much I may be wounding yours. I can no longer help thanking you for your unexampled kindness to my poor sister. Ever since I have known of it, I have been most anxious to acknowledge to you how grateful I feel it. Were it known to the rest of the family, I should not merely have my own gratitude to express." She can't take it anymore. She has learned from her aunt that Darcy saved their family, that he put forward an enormous amount of money to make things right with Lydia and Wickham. And she just has to thank him. She can't just be in the same room with him, as she has been a couple of times. She can't just exchange pleasantries with him. She has to thank him pointedly. But he's shocked, because he thought that he enjoined everybody to secrecy. "I am sorry, exceedingly sorry," replied Darcy in a tone of surprise and emotion, "that you have ever been informed of what may, in a mistaken light, have given you uneasiness. I didn't think Mrs. Gardiner so little to be trusted." But it wasn't Mrs. Gardiner. It was Lydia that blurted it out. "You must not blame my aunt. Lydia's thoughtlessness first betrayed to me that you had been concerned in the matter, and of course I could not rest till I knew the particulars. Let me thank you again and again, in the name of all my family, for that generous compassion which induced you to take so much trouble and bear so many mortifications for the sake of discovering them." "If you will thank me," he replied. Oh, I wish I could see this done well. I've seen this scene portrayed a dozen times in various medium, including in local stage. But anyway, if you will thank me," he replied, "let it be for yourself alone. That the wish of giving happiness to you might add force to the other inducements which led me on, I shall not attempt to deny, but your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I only thought of you. I thought only of you. Elizabeth was too much embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, her companion added, "You are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affection and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on the subject forever." His feelings are unchanged. Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present advances. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But, though she could not look, she could listen, and he told her of his feelings, which, in proving what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. No. No, it's true. Probably Darcy has never been happier. And no, it's true, Elizabeth is not looking directly at his face, so she can't tell exactly how much his new happiness transfuses his face with light. But Jane Austen can do that, and doesn't. All this book we've been waiting, and she doesn't show it to us. Let's go over it again. We're never going to do a read-through of Pride and Prejudice again. We might as well suffer together. Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. Do we hear her say that? No, we do not. Do we hear the conversation? No, we do not. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before. Well, you made him up, Jane. So has he ever felt this much, or hasn't he? Probably. If hearing that the love of his life actually has changed her mind about him doesn't make him happier than he ever has been, then what has made him happier? That should be the subject of this book. And he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do. How about you give us that? You are perfectly happy to give us chapter and verse of Mr. Collins expressing himself in love when he has no idea what it feels like and was being a worm while he did it. You're perfectly happy to do that. But you won't give us this, that we've been waiting the whole book for. Bad enough you didn't give us any of this between Jane and Bingley. But between Elizabeth and Darcy, you won't do it. Had Elizabeth been able to encounter his eye, she might have seen how well the expression of heartfelt delight diffused over his face became him. But though she could not look, she could listen. So can we. We can also listen. What is he saying? And he told her of feelings which, in proving of what importance she was to him, made his affection every moment more valuable. Yeah, what are those feelings? What does he say? No. No. One of the greatest crimes against art ever done. Anyway, it's you picture the Lord of the Rings. We find Gollum. We find the ring. We have the Council of Elrond. We know how vital this thing is to the relation of the whole world. The company marches off to Mordor. They assemble. We know it's going to be trouble. We know the ring is going to tempt at least one of them into trouble because they learned that in Lothlorien. They decide to push on anyway. They've already lost Gandalf. They don't want to lose anybody else. They decide after healing and grieving in Lorien to move on in boats. And then the harpist at Lothlorien sings songs about what may or may not have happened to them ever since. But we don't follow them. And we don't hear or see what happens. In other words, lady novelists. Am I right? Up top. Anyway. Anyway, they walked on without knowing in what direction. There was too much to be thought and felt and said for attention to any other subject. Yeah, there's a lot to be thought and felt and especially said. Great if we knew any of it. She soon learnt that they were indeed indebted for their present good understanding to the efforts of his aunt, who did call on him in her return to London, and there relate her journey to Longbourn, its motives, and the substance of her conversation with Elizabeth, dwelling emphatically on every expression of the latter, which, in her ladyship's apprehension, particularly denoted her perverseness and assurance in the belief that such a relation must assist her endeavours to obtain that promise from her nephew, which she had refused to give, which Elizabeth refused to promise this will not happen. Now she's wanting that promise from Darcy. But, unlucky for her ladyship, its effect had been exactly contrariwise. It taught me to hope, said he, as I had scarcely ever allowed myself to hope before. I knew enough of your disposition to be certain that, had you been absolutely, irrevocably decided against me, you would have acknowledged it to Lady Catherine, frankly and openly. Elizabeth coloured and laughed as she replied, Yes, you know enough of my frankness to believe me capable of that. After abusing you so abominably to your face, I could have no scruple in abusing you to all your relations. What did you say of me that I did not deserve? For though your accusations were ill-founded, formed on mistaken premises, my behaviour to you at that time had merited the severest reproof. It was unpardonable. I cannot think of it without abhorrence. We will not quarrel for the greater share of blame annexed to that evening, said Elizabeth. The conduct of neither, if strictly examined, will be irreproachable. But since then, we have both, I hope, improved in civility. I cannot be so easily reconciled to myself. The recollection of what I then said, of my conduct, my manners, my expressions during the whole of it, is now, and has been for many months, inexpressibly painful to me. Your reproof, so well applied, I shall never forget, had you behaved more like in a more gentlemanlike manner. Those were your words. You know not, you can scarcely conceive how they have tortured me, though it was some time, I confess, before I was reasonable enough to allow their justice. He was blinded by rage at first. I was certainly very far from expecting them to make so strong an impression. I had not the smallest idea of their being felt in such a way. I can easily believe it. You thought me then devoid of every proper feeling. I am sure you did. The turn of your countenance I shall never forget, as you said that I could not have addressed you in any possible way that would have induced you to accept me. That line that stood out so much when we read it. It stood out to him as well. Oh, do not repeat what I said then. These recollections will not do at all. I assure you, I have long been most heartily ashamed of it. Darcy mentioned his letter. Did it, said he, did it soon make you think better of me? Did you, on reading it, give any credit to its contents? We know exactly that it did. She didn't get up from that letter until it had changed her thoughts completely. She explained what its effects on her had been, and how gradually all her former prejudices had been removed. I knew, said he, that what I wrote must give you pain, but it was necessary. I hope you've destroyed the letter. There was one part especially, the opening of it, which I should dread to have your power of reading again. I can remember some expressions which might justly make you hate me. The letter shall certainly be burnt, if you believe it essential to the preservation of my regard, but though we have both reason to think my opinions not entirely unalterable, they are not, I hope, quite so easily changed as that implies. I find it hard to believe that Elizabeth will ever destroy that letter. When I wrote that letter, replied Darcy, I believed myself perfectly calm and cool, but I am since convinced it was written in a dreadful bitterness of spirit. The letter, perhaps, began in bitterness, but it did not end so. The adieu was charity itself. But think no more of the letter. The feelings of the person who wrote and the person who received it are now widely different from what they were then, that every unpleasant circumstance attending it ought to be forgotten. You must learn some of my philosophy. Think only of the past as its remembrance gives you pleasure. I cannot give you credit for any philosophy of the kind. Your retrospections must be so totally devoid of reproach that the contentment arising from them is not of philosophy, but what is much better, of ignorance. But with me it is not so. Painful recollection will intrude, which ought not to be repelled. I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child, I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, an only son, for many years an only child, I was spoilt by my parents, who though good themselves, my father particularly, all that was benevolent and amiable, allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world, to wish, at least, to think meanly of their sense and worth compared to my own. Such I was from 8 to 28, and such I might still have been, but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. You showed me how insufficient were all my pretensions to please a woman worthy of being pleased. Well, that sounds wonderful, and that eases my mind just a little. It makes me ease up just a little. That is wonderful, lovely stuff, although there's Reynolds. We have the Pemberley housekeeper's account that Darcy's being too hard on himself, that he wasn't told a selfish, horrible, self-absorbed prick from 8 to 28. We know from her testimony, if we're supposed to believe her when it comes to other things, I think we can believe her when it comes to him. But maybe when he says my own family, he means the staff as well. Had you then persuaded yourself that I should? Indeed, I had. What will you think of my vanity? I believed you to be wishing, expecting my addresses. My manners must have been in fault, but not intentionally, I assure you. I never meant to deceive you, but my spirits might often lead me wrong. How you must have hated me after that evening. That evening that we read about. Wasn't that fun, that chapter? Hate you? I was angry, perhaps, at first, but my anger soon began to take a proper direction. I'm almost afraid of asking what you thought of me. When we met at Pemberley, you blamed me for coming. No, indeed. I felt nothing but surprise. Your surprise could not be greater than mine in being noticed by you. My conscience told me that I deserved no extraordinary politeness, and I confess that I did not expect to receive more than my due. They met at Pemberley, they meet by accident, and she is assuming that he hates her. And instead, he is just the opposite in every way, not just to her, but to her relations, who he scorned in his letter. My object then, replied Darcy, was to show you by every civility in my power that I was not so mean as to resent the past, and I hope to obtain your forgiveness, to lessen your ill opinion by letting you see that your reproofs had been attended to. How soon any other wishes introduced themselves I can hardly tell, but I believe in about half an hour I had seen you. He then told her of Georgiana's delight in her acquaintance, and of her disappointment at its sudden interruption, which naturally leading to the cause of that interruption, she soon learnt that his resolution of following her to Derbyshire in quest of her sister, and had been formed before he quitted the inn, and that his gravity and thoughtlessness there had arisen from no other struggle than what such a purpose must comprehend. She expressed her gratitude again, but it was too painful a subject to each to be dwelt on farther. I get the feeling they're going to be talking it over their whole lives. But this is what we get. This is what they're rehashing the book. This is Jane Austen, the writer at her table, revealing herself. If this is very much what a writer would rehash, not the stuff that I want to hear, but the stuff that's already been in the book. After walking several miles in a leisurely manner, and too busy to know anything about it, they found at last, on examining their watches, that it was time to be home. What could become of Mr. Bingley and Jane was a wonder which introduced the discussion of their affairs. Darcy was delighted with their engagement. His friend had given him the earliest information of it. I must ask whether you were surprised, said Elizabeth. Not at all. When I went away, I felt that it should soon happen. That is to say, you had given your permission. I guessed as much. And though he exclaimed at the term, she found it had pretty much been the case. She's teasing him already. She's teasing him still. I think we get a very wonderful little glimpse here of what their married life is going to be like. On the evening before my going to London, said he, I made a confession to him, which I believe I ought to have made long ago. I told him of all that had occurred to make my former interference in his affairs absurd and impertinent. His surprise was great. He had never had the slightest suspicion. I told him, moreover, that I believed myself mistaken in supposing, as I had done, that your sister was indifferent to him, and as I could easily perceive that his attachment to her was unabated, I felt no doubt that their happiness together. Elizabeth could not help smiling at his easy manner of directing his friend. Did you speak from your own observation, said she, when you told him that my sister loved him, or merely from my information last spring? From the former. I had narrowly observed her during the 2 visits which I had lately made here, and was convinced of her affection. Jane thought she was hiding it. But I said it was obvious to everyone, and it was certainly obvious to Darcy. And your assurance of it, I suppose, carried immediate conviction to him? It did. Bingley is most unaffectedly modest. His diffidence has prevented his depending on his own judgment in so anxious a case, but his reliance on mine made everything easy. I was obliged to confess one thing, which for a time, and not unjustly, offended him. And we know what that thing is. Darcy's only real crime here. I could not allow myself to conceal that your sister had been in town 3 months last winter, and that I had known it, and purposely kept it from him. He was angry. But his anger, I am persuaded, lasted no longer than he remained in any doubt of your sister's sentiments. He has heartily forgiven me now. So Bingley was angry until he learned that it didn't hurt anything, that it didn't cost him anything. But it'd been nice to see that scene. I'm not expecting... If Jane Austen won't give us the scene I want, she's not going to give us that scene in some club in London. Elizabeth longed to observe that Mr. Bingley had been a most delightful friend, so easily guided that his worth was invaluable, but she checked herself. She remembered that he had yet to be learned to laugh at. That's Darcy, had yet to learn how to be laughed at. And it was rather too early to begin. In anticipating the happiness of Bingley, which of course was to be the inferior only to his own, he continued the conversation till they reached the house. In the hall, they parted. So I was saying in the last chapter, 57, that a major thing has now been completely concluded. Jane and Bingley are affianced to be wed. Well, now Elizabeth and Darcy are affianced to be wed. Now they have pledged themselves to each other. Nobody knows it but them at the moment, but in a sense, I don't want to elevate it higher than it belongs, but in a sense, this crime against art is the finish of this book. All that follows from here is closing action, because the opening line of the novel and the main concern of the book is now done on every front imaginable, except for Kitty and Mary. So every front is now covered, but the ending is wonderful. We will read the next few chapters and have a wonderful time wrapping this up. So that is Pride and Prejudice, the scene of all scenes. I will wrap this up for now, and I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.